Jigang, I met, as he mentioned, we keep bumping in with usually a 10-year gap, I bump into him. So every 10 years, I have an expectation of seeing him. Last time was at Harvard, and before that in Princeton. Thank you very much for this invitation to deliver this distinguished lecture in Hong Kong. I've been here many times to your city, but never to this university. So this was one of my unfulfilled ambition. So when Professor Tao invited me, I just felt I had to do it. Thank you very much once again. I should tell you by way of advertisement that since he mentioned Beyond the Invisible Hand, that book of mine, it's in Chinese as well. So I feel rather good about it, that it's my only book that has been translated into Chinese. Yeah. Okay, with that, let me go straight away into the topic. I'm going to speak on the World Bank's 2 goals. I got into this topic really running full speed because when I joined the World Bank in October 2012, the discussion was already taking place in the World Bank about what should be the World Bank's goals. What should be the motivation behind the World Bank? What is it that we are after? And I hit the debate midway through when the debate was going on. It was a very active, energetic debate. And you can at one level see the need for this because for a corporation or a private firm, it's very clear what they are after. They are after making more money. Larger profit for the shareholders, greater value, that's what they are after. When it's a national government, as I have worked on as Chief Economic Advisor to the Indian government, Mr. Kwok here worked similarly here, you know what you're after. It's that region, that economy, that you're trying to make it grow faster, develop faster, that's your objective. Now, World Bank can't claim that our objective is to make the World Bank better off. The World Bank is not a profit-making organization, nor is it an organization like a country trying to increase its own welfare. It's something else that it's after. And the World Bank president, the new president, felt that it's very important for us to be able to write down certain key objectives that the World Bank is after, and we go for that. In the beginning, when the debate started, and when I joined, the debate had already started, as you would expect, there was a bit of a tendency for the goals to multiply. You have to eradicate poverty, you have to have the world growing faster, you want climate to be sustainable, the world environment, you want gender equality, and the goals were becoming too many. Now, we decided very early that we can't do that. There are many things in life which matter, but if you write down too many things, you dissipate the focus. You know, there is a story of a man charged of beating up another person, going to court, being taken to court. When he was taken to court, he came in and he said that, I've got 3 good reasons why I should be pardoned. And everyone was very impressed. 3 reasons instead of 1 or 2. And he said that the 3 reasons are this. You're charging me of violence and beating up this person, but you have to pardon me because number 1, you can check that the day on which I'm supposed to have beaten up this person, I was not even in town. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2, if you check my religious background, violence is prohibited. So because of my adherence to my religion, I would never use violence. And the 3rd reason why you should pardon me is that he hit me first. Trying to give too many reasons, as you can see, you begin to, too many reasons, too many factors tend to contradict one another. And it is actually very important for me as an academic to keep things as lean, clean as possible. And of course, you have to use your common sense. When you write down 2 objectives, 3 objectives, you realize life does not end with that. There are many other things you're after, but have a few things that you're going for. With that in mind, the first target was an easy one, because that's what the World Bank has had for a long time on its books. Certainly, actually, it goes back probably to McNamara, but even the time of Wolfenson, which is that the World Bank is trying to battle poverty around the world. So target number 1 was battling poverty, but we wanted to make it a bit more specific. The first goal is the end of extreme poverty, which is defined as $1.25 a day, purchasing power parity corrected, to bring an end to this by the year 2030. By bringing an end to this kind of poverty, what we meant is you have to be realistic. There'll be some frictional poverty which you can't. There'll be war, there will be battles, conflict, there'll be some poverty. But if we can bring it down to less than 3% of the world population, that will be a worthwhile target. 2-3 problems with this. Number 1, we were getting a lot of criticism that $1.25 a day, PPP corrected, is too low a line. You know, $1.25 with purchasing power parity corrected in a country like India or even China, mainland China, will mean less than 40 cents per day per person. That's a shockingly low line. That's your total expenditure. So there were people who were telling us that, look, shouldn't you draw the line higher up? Because, I mean, it's demeaning to draw it so low. Fair enough. But once you pause and realize that even with this low line, more than 1 billion people today live below that line, you realize the shocking state of the world, that at one level we have so much prosperity, so much growth and so much welfare, but 1/7 of the world population lives at less than roughly 40 cents per day of expenditure. It's a shocking commentary, embarrassing commentary on the world that this persists. And we felt that, yes, there are many other targets you want to, but let's be determined and think in terms of bringing this kind of poverty to an end by 2030, and that was one of our targets. Yeah, I should clarify one important thing about this. This target, by the way, is a global target. So world, total population of the world, less than 3%. We should bring it down by 2030. As soon as we declared this, we were getting a lot of criticism from the World Bank's executive directors and governors that you have to be aware that there are some countries where poverty can be very high and still world poverty could be less than 3% if you take care of the most large countries. If Chinese poverty goes to virtually zero, India's poverty comes down a lot, Indonesian poverty comes down, Nigerian poverty comes down, you can have small countries with 80% poor people, 90% poor people, but the world population, it'll still be less than 3%. We decided not to mess up this target, but beyond the target, there is a bit of an idea which we have not written up formally, which is the principle of no country left behind, which means that while we are trying to bring the world poverty down to less than 3%, we will also try to make sure that in the process, there will be no country where poverty will be more than 30%. 30% is a generous number, but in the current world, there are many countries where more than 80% of the population, 80% of the population is below this line. So that's still quite a target that we are after. The second target was a source of great debate, shared prosperity. On this, that we decided broadly that we should have another target, not just on poverty, but something to do with sharing, that in the world there should be some space for sharing of prosperity. But the debate was going from one extreme to another. Of at one level, we were doing the kind of thing that Professor Tao and I used to do 15, 20 years ago, very technical, theoretical work. We decided, at one stage, we were discussing in terms of Amartya Sen's notion of the real national income. This was for, if there are students of economic theory, you may be familiar with this. He had a very famous paper in Review of Economic Studies, where he created an index of a country's welfare, which is a combination of growth and income distribution, Gini coefficient. It's a combined formula. What was very nice about this paper by Sen is it was developed from basic axioms. So almost the way you do geometry, you write down some axioms, and from those axioms you can derive the Sen measure of a country's welfare. If I remember that right, it is income multiplied by 1 minus Gini coefficient. We talked about that, but we felt it's a bit too technical. For most finance ministers and governors, they wouldn't even know what it's about, and we would not get enough traction. So we wanted to go over to something which would be easier to understand. In big organizations, which is true in governments, in the bank, there is a bit of a tendency to go to the other extreme and keep things so vague that no one will be able to pin down as to exactly what you're saying. You know, vagueness has its advantages. You get good marks for being a diplomat. You're leaving everything open, but it also just gives you far too much space to do whatever you want. So we didn't want to go there either. Finally, what we settled on, and on this I have a bit of a personal role, I pushed for this, is a very simple measure. By shared prosperity, what we mean is the growth rate of income, per capita income, of the bottom 40% of each country. So the goal of shared prosperity, unlike the first one on poverty, is a country-specific goal. And the goal is not a target, but we were saying that in each country, we will bring pressure and we will do analysis, arguing that the bottom 40%'s growth will be tracked, and you will try to have the bottom 40% do better. This is the notion of sharing. When we started doing this, there was a lot of people were warning us, coming to me and saying that, look, you are going to get a lot of objection and criticism from World Bank's big client countries. And the two countries that were mentioned to me that would be very critical of the World Bank was China and India. Now, the ground that was given to me was the following, that China and India, if you look at these countries' growth rate, both these countries, China even more so than India, the average growth is very fast, but the bottom 40% growth is less than that. So the whole country is rising very rapidly, but the bottom 40% is rising less rapidly than the rest, which is true of India as well. But to that, my response is, this will just lead to a good, solid discussion. I can quite see the Chinese or the Indians coming to me and saying that, look, you should not criticize us because it is true that our bottom 40% is growing slower than our top 60%, but our bottom 40% is growing faster than the bottom 40% of people in most countries. So it should not be a criticism. And I feel that's a valid thing. Not that I would immediately agree, but this is something to discuss and engage with the country and say, yes, it's a tribute that your bottom 40% is doing better than bottom 40% elsewhere. But at the same time, if you can do so well for your country, why not pay even greater attention to the bottom 40% and work on that? So there were other criticisms, and one more slightly technical thing, let me explain to you in words. When we are looking at the growth rate of the bottom 40% of a population, what we are not doing is the following. Some people make this mistake, that we find out who the poorest 40% is in a country. Then over the next 10 years, you track the growth rate of this population. That is not what we are doing. We are looking at the bottom 40% in each period. They can be different people. And looking at the growth rate of this changing population, the bottom 40%, whoever that is. This is very important, because with this comes in an axiom of economics called anonymity, which says that we are not looking at specific individuals. Whoever is in the bottom 40%, we are tracking that. And that also means that going for the growth rate of the bottom 40% means you cannot ignore altogether people who are above the 40% line. Why? Because if you ignore altogether people who are just above 40% and try to push up the growth of the poorest 40%, in the next period, the people who are just above 40% will fall into your bottom 40% group. So by looking at the bottom 40%, whoever that be, in an anonymous fashion, we are actually indirectly paying some attention to people who are above that also, so that they don't fall into this category. Is that clear? So I will, if not, you can stop and ask me. Okay, so that's what the criterion is. Another criticism that we were getting is the following. That look, if you just say that maximize the growth rate of the bottom 40%, you are not paying any special attention to inequality. You're just saying, let the bottom 40% grow faster. To that, again, my response is, if you make available the data on how the bottom 40% is performing in a country, how the whole population is performing is always available. That's your growth figure. Once you put the two together, there is immediately an indirect, it's obvious. Is the bottom 40% falling off or catching up? You don't have to actually create a ratio of the growth rate of the whole population and the bottom 40% to get to that. Anyway, this whole set of discussion, debate, and we finally settled that we are going to keep just these two as the World Bank's goals. One is a global goal with some attention that no country must be left behind. And the other one is a goal where you look at each country. There was again a little bit of worry on this, that as soon as you're saying you're looking at each country, you're looking at even the rich countries. And some of the richest countries, very powerful countries, don't do very well in terms of the bottom 40%. United States is a good example. United States does very well, but compared to, for instance, Scandinavian countries, the bottom 40% does not do as well. But again, I like to believe that the rich and the powerful countries will be in a position to say that, yes, we have some strengths, we have some weaknesses also, and want to participate in this debate and discussion, which would open up through this target. So those were the two targets. And just to put aside that people were bringing in, what about gender? What about inclusion? What about sustainability? Now, some of these things come in indirectly into this. When we are saying that raise the growth rate of the bottom 40%, we are not saying that do this for 10 years and after that let it crash. As soon as you say that you want to do it in a sustained fashion, sustainability is in there. For a society's bottom 40% to do well, you have to be sensitive to gender. So a lot of this is coming in indirectly, but over and above that, I must tell you, at times I get a bit worried when, having laid down these criteria, I find people, about everything they try to match it against these two goals and say, is it worthwhile or not? Over and above everything else, we human beings have common sense. And we know that everything can't be written down in two formulas. There are many other things in life which matter, and I like to believe that all those things will be parts and parcel of what the World Bank is trying to do. Now into some analysis. Let me be here for a while I read out. So, actually I'm going to start with another figure. Let me start with this. Where are we today and where have we come from? You will see that improvement, and I'm still taking the same poverty line, $1.25 a day. In 1980, 43% of the world population was below this line. In 2010, which is the latest year for which we have data for the entire world, it's down to 15.7% of the world is poor. So it's a huge improvement that has taken place during this time. And you can see in terms of individual countries, China has probably made the steepest gain. Poverty has just come down very, very rapidly. India, not so rapidly, but still it's coming down. It's about half the rate of where it was. Indonesia, it's come down very rapidly. Some countries' progress is not good at all. Nigeria poverty has gone up a little bit, so that's the broad global scenario. But now I'm going to go back to the one I showed you just now. Let me break it up into regions and show you what's happening in regions. The 2015 is a projection. For now, you can ignore that. Look at 2010. The headcount ratio means the percentage of population of that region below the poverty line. The biggest pool of the poor is not surprising in sub-Saharan Africa. And the other parts, and there are some parts where it'll be literally zero. We are not putting that. Europe, if you take Europe leaving out Central Asia, it'll be zero. And in terms of the numbers, you can see what is there. 2015 is a projection. Okay, this, I'm going to explain this in a moment. But let me come back here and tell you. This 3% that we are trying to bring down poverty to, you should be clear that that is not a forecast of where poverty will be, but that's a target. So it is not that poverty is naturally going to go there. And we did the following calculation for that. If you make the following assumption, that starting now, that the growth rate of countries remains the same as was the growth rate over the last 10 years. Actually, last 10 years is wrong, what is saying there. During the first 10 years of this century. So 2000 to 2010, whatever the growth rate was in each country, the same growth rate takes place up to 2030. Now, I should point out that 2000 to 2010 was a period of very rapid growth for emerging economies in particular. So we are being very optimistic. If you take that growth, hold income distribution constant, and project it forward, what will happen to poverty? Well, the world poverty will reach 5.5%, which will have 456 million people below the poverty line. You will not get to your target of 3%. So relying on growth alone, the best scenario is unlikely to take you there. Now, you know, I mean, anytime you're speaking about the future, you should be aware that doubt is a good mental faculty to have. You can never be certain. Who knows how the future will unfold? But it does look very unlikely that through a growth policy itself, you can take the world to a 3% poverty. One mistake that people make at times is the following. It's true that growth has been a major driver in bringing poverty down and promoting the welfare of the bottom 40%. In fact, there are some studies, very good empirical studies, which will show that the growth rate of the poorest people in the world is driven mainly by the average growth of the world. So that when the whole world grows, those benefits reach the bottom 40%, and apparently some 77% of the improvement of the bottom 40% of the world took place because of average growth. That empirical finding is correct, very carefully done. From that, some people conclude, and that conclusion is wrong, therefore we should rely on growth to reach the poorest people and benefit them. You know, if you look at the past, whatever was the driver, and say that we should continue to use the same instruments, in 1928, when the antibiotic or penicillin was invented, you would have said that year, having done studies of the past, that we should never use penicillin, because whenever people have got well from illness, it was never through the use of antibiotics. 100% of previous cures were through non-antibiotic methods. From that, if you concluded that therefore in the future we should use only non-antibiotic methods, that would be a wrong conclusion, even though it is true that before 1928, close to 100% of all cures was non-antibiotic. Why was that the case? Because antibiotics had not been discovered. And also that the rate of cure was very, very poor. Lots of people don't overuse antibiotics, so I should warn you while I'm making this case. But we should be aware that the fact that one particular treatment was the standard treatment up to a particular year does not mean that that is the treatment that has to be work in the future. Then you will never go and invent and look for newer measures. So you will have to look for newer measures as we tackle policy here onwards. And I'm going to take you through some of that. Actually, this is just a quick, good-looking picture. There is no other reason why you should look at it, but it looks very nice. This is something that we had it in our tables. What it shows is the bottom 40% of a population consists of who in different countries. So the shared prosperity target applies to whom, and there should be no surprise that in the poorest countries like Mali and Bangladesh, the bottom 40%, entire bottom 40% consists of the extreme poor, people who are less than $1.25 a day. You go to countries which are better off, the bottom 40% of the population will be some people who are extremely poor and some people who are moderately poor, from $1.25 a day to $4 a day, and go to better off countries like the Russian Federation or Thailand, and it will also have some middle income people will be in the bottom 40%. No surprises in that, but I wanted to show you what it looks like. I want to now discuss a little bit of policy, and of two kinds. Just give me one I'll do without any PowerPoint, and then I'll take you through a tiny bit of theory exercise with one picture, so we can revisit what we used to do 20 years ago. But before that, a little bit of what kinds of policies for the poor. This is my belief, that growth is important, especially for poor countries coming out of poverty. You do want to have high growth, and you go to any emerging country, talk to people, they are hungry for growth. I mean, I worked for 3 years as chief economic advisor to India, and I know that the country is hungry for growth. It's been very poor, it wants to rise out of that, and it wants to grow. But that's not the end of life. There are many other things in life that ought to be appreciated and you should be interested in. I personally believe that in today's world, where there is so much inequality, that there should be some direct action to help the poorest people. And for me, the biggest thing is inequality which comes about through life. One person works hard and does better. Yes, many of those inequalities are justified inequalities. Many of those inequalities create the drive for greater economic growth. You should have that. But in life, contrary to what some people tell you, huge amount of inequality is inequality at birth. Some people are born abysmally poor, where there is hopeless chance of takeoff, and some people are born rich, very rich. So right at the start, which has nothing to do with how hard you've worked, because when you're born, you have not worked at all. Whether you love leisure or don't love leisure, those things don't matter at that time. I'm originally from Calcutta, and as long as my mother was alive, I would go there very regularly. I still go there very regularly. I would visit my mother and go for a walk in a rich area, which was close to not her area, but next to her was a very rich area. I would go for a morning walk. And the thought would each time cross my mind that a child who's being born in this very rich area and a child who's being born in a slum in Calcutta, to tell both of them that work hard and you can make it is nonsense. I mean, when you're starting with such a great disadvantage, you're blighting the chance. And the world has a responsibility that you have to reach out for the poorest people, do something to bring them up. What do you do? It's a big question. I'm glad that there are writers, prominent writers like Thomas Piketty now, who have joined in this debate and contributing to this. These are important issues. I will get into the deeper questions of what do you do about these great injustices in life. Can't be all addressed in a lecture. And maybe we can't at one go address them anyway. You have to gradually think about them. But let me take you into a detailed policy matters, is to reach out to the poor. I believe that over and above growth, the government also has some responsibilities. The government has to reach healthcare, basic education. For the poorest people, maybe even some food you have to take to them, make it available so that they survive through that better. Here, however, you have to put on your economist's hat a little bit. Just having the good intention and passion is not good enough. To reach to the poorest people, you have to design programs which are incentive compatible and don't lead to too much leakage. Again, when I was doing my Indian job, India has a big food program for the poor. The way it is run is the government of India goes and buys up basic grains, wheat, rice from the market, and then sells them back at a low price to the poor. It's a huge program. There are 500,000 stores all over India that sends the food out back again to the people. So the government buys from the farmers and sells it out. What we found out is that the leakage that takes place in this was 44% of the food grain was leaking out. So just having the intention is not good enough. You have to design carefully. When we looked into the design structure, what we found is that what is happening is we are not taking into account the rationality of all the agents. Once you realize that there is rationality all around, even the little shops that are supposed to give out the grain are rational, then you design the program differently. So it's a little bit of game theory being used. It's not good enough for you to be rational yourself, but you have to realize that the shopkeeper who's being asked to give out the grain is also rational. The government agent who's playing a role in this is also rational. There is rationality all around. And if you underestimate the rationality of the agents, think of them as robotic players, and try to do this, you will not meet with success. The rationality of the other side, there's a very silly story, but I must tell you the story. A Scientific American once asked me to write a short essay on game theory. And I was trying to give it the shortest introduction to game theory, and I recounted the story which I had heard in India, which is about being rational yourself is not good enough. If you don't understand the rationality of other people, you'll make mistakes. The story is a silly one, but I'll still tell you. It's a hat seller who is going from one town to another. When in the middle of the journey, he feels sleepy. He puts down all the hats on the ground and goes off to sleep. When he wakes up, he finds that all the hats have been taken to a treetop by monkeys. The hat seller is desperate. He's a poor man. He lives by selling his hats. What will he do? In his desperation, he takes off his own hat and flings it down on the ground. You know, monkeys are great imitators. So as soon as the monkeys see him flinging the hat down, they all start flinging their hats down. So the man goes, collects all the hats, and goes away. He's very happy. 40 years pass. His grandson has become a hat seller, is going from one town to another, feels sleepy, puts down the hats, and goes off to sleep. When he wakes up, all the hats are gone. He looks up and sees that monkeys have come down and taken the hats to the treetop. What will he do? He's a poor man, he sells hats. When he suddenly remembers his grandfather's story, what his grandfather told him. So he takes off his hat and throws it down on the ground. But now only one monkey comes down, picks up the last hat, comes to him, gives him a slap, and says, "You think only you have a grandfather?" This is the shortest introduction to game theory. Game theory, unlike individual decision making, is interactive rationality. You have to always put yourself in the shoes of the other side and do thinking in that person's. The Indian food distribution system, what was happening is, to me, is clear enough. When you buy the food at a market price, and then at a subsidized price give it to 500,000 little shops all over India, and you're telling these shopkeepers, now below the market price, you sell it to the poor people who will come with a card. Many of these shopkeepers, what they do is they sell off the food at the market price, higher market price. And when the poor people come, they say that supply hasn't come. 44% of the food leaks out. What you need is not to close down the program. I don't think you should close down. You still have to reach your poorest people. But you have to design better. And the better design in this case, you have to think hard, but one possibility is don't give the subsidy to the shop and tell the shop to give the subsidy to the people. Give the subsidy directly to the people and then let the people buy the food at market price from any store. That's going to change the system. Currently, when a poor person goes into a ration shop, the ration shop shopkeeper knows that I'm supposed to sell to this person at a below market price. And the urge is not to sell. Sell it at a market price and not sell to this person. Whereas if you've given the subsidy to the poor person as cash or whatever, and then the poor person goes into a shop and says, give me food grain, I'll buy it at the market price like anyone else. Inside the shop, the poor person's dignity is as much as the rich person's dignity. It's a change in the system which would vastly improve the delivery of the same thing that you're trying to deliver. But you know, once you work in government, you'll know that winning over takes a lot of time and effort in terms of arguments. I think in India you will see some change taking place in some of these delivery mechanisms, but this is something that I was arguing continuously. So there's a lot of work to be done. But what I want to do in the last 10 minutes, is that all right, roughly 10 more minutes, is to take you into a little bit of an exercise of decision making in the global arena in terms of inequality. But before I go into the global arena, decision making in terms of inequality and poverty. Okay, behind this graph is a little bit of algebra, but I don't have to give you the algebra. I think I can explain the graph to you well enough that you'll understand what's happening. Suppose in a country there are two sets of people. There are poor people who have a zero income and rich people who have an income, higher income of A. So, is there a pointer or I can do it here. This is the tax rate. When the tax rate is 0, the rich earn A and the poor earn 0. The blue line, I'll explain the line to you, and the red line is the poor people's income, rich people's income. I'll explain all that. But when the tax is 0, this is the income of the poor, this is the income of the rich. When I say the income of the poor is 0, most non-economists feel very uncomfortable. How can you live at 0? What we mean is, it's 0 is defined in a way which is subsistence or something like that. So it's not really 0, but defined in a way, it doesn't matter. It's a benchmark which is very low. In this country, let's assume that the only way that you benefit the poor is to tax from the rich and give it to the poor. That's all. So I wanted to keep the analysis very simple. So there's no food subsidy, no health benefit, anything. You take some money from the rich and give it to the poor. So the only purpose of the system of taxation is to take from the rich and give to the poor. Tax rate can go from 0 to 1 or 100%. As you increase the tax rate, now you'll be able to follow very easily. As you increase the tax rate, the income of the rich begins to fall because it's the rich who have an income, you're taxing them. The post-tax income begins to fall for the rich, and the post-tax income for the poor begins to rise. Is this clear? Because the government is simply taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. As you continue to tax more and more, the rich will also work less. You're taking away their income. So two things are happening for the rich. They are working less and less, and more of their money is being taken away. I'm assuming that when you set the tax rate at 100%, the rich will not work at all. I mean, if you're going to take away everything, I'm not going to work. Your income goes to 0. Since the poor live on the transfer from the rich to the poor, when the tax rate is 100%, what will be the income of the poor? Can you see that it will be 0? Because if the rich earn 0, there's nothing to tax, the poor will get 0. So the two graphs end up again at 0 because both of them have been drained out. In this country, if you're interested in only maximizing the income of the poorest people, the bottom 40% criterion, what should the tax rate be? So what are you trying to do? You're trying to make the poorest people as well off as possible. The tax rate is going to be M. Do you see at that M, the poorest people are as well off as they can be. M for moderate taxation is the numbers. For some realistic numbers, this turned out to be 33%. But don't give any importance to the actual number. That will depend on a lot of empirical stuff you have to do to get to that. But M is the tax rate which maximizes the income of the poorest people. But now you can see the difference between trying to make the poorest people better off and the objective of total equality. If you wanted total equality, what would the tax rate have to be? H. At H, also 100% would give you total equality at 0, but at H you'll get equality completely because the rich and the poor have the same income at H. But here is the catch. To get equality, you have to make the poor people even worse off than they would have been. So equality is not worth it. The poor, you're hurting the poor to get to equality. So this diagram illustrates that if you're simply focusing on the poorest people, trying to make them better off, don't go for total equality because you'll hurt everybody, including the poorest people. Stop at a tax rate like M. This opens up a bit of a global problem. If every country, suppose, chooses a tax rate of M to start with, the poor people are well off. Soon a little competition will break out. If you lower your tax rate, assume perfect mobility of people. If you lower your tax rate a little bit, soon the skilled people from other countries will begin to come into your country. You will be able to tax them and benefit your poor people even more. So there will be a bit of a tendency for you to cut your tax rate below M in order to attract the skilled people. You're telling people around the world that, look, I'm taxing you less. Come here. We are seeing some of this competition in the domain of corporate income, profit tax. Japan is right now lowering its corporate taxation. Britain did it some time ago. Ireland had done it some time ago, and there was a very nice OECD paper showing that corporate taxation often breaks out in this competition. You keep lowering, and lowering for a realistic reason, but it often takes you into a prisoner's dilemma, that you keep lowering in order to attract corporations and skill from other countries, but collectively you do harm for yourself. This is a bit of a serious global problem where no individual country can do anything, but you need a global policy to tackle this. So on to my last slide. The problem is this. Let me sit here and walk you through. This is the same analysis I did a moment ago with those graphs, but now in a global situation with two countries, country A and country B. Remember from the previous picture that the tax rate M was the ideal tax. That is the tax rate M. So if both countries charge a tax rate of M, they get a high welfare of 3 each. Okay, those are the payoffs of 3,3 are the payoffs. But now, if one country cuts the tax rate from moderate to low, M to L, then that country becomes better off because you attract more skill. So your welfare goes up to 4, and the country that has held on to the M rate will do worse at 1. Starting from here, you would have moved up here. The country that cut the tax rate does better. Okay? So this is not, if you've done any amount of game theory, one equilibrium notion you would have heard of is a Nash equilibrium. MM is not a Nash equilibrium because one of them will violate and move up, or this country will violate and move here. If both countries lower the tax rate, this one here and that one there, they will end up 2-2, the welfare goes down. Each one trying to do better for its own citizens will end up with a lower welfare of 2-2. Suppose they are charging, both of them are charging a tax rate of low tax rate and a welfare of 2-2. Is that an equilibrium? If you look at the payoff matrix, you will see that is not an equilibrium, because if both of them are charging a tax rate of L, if one of them charges a tax rate which is negligible, N for negligible, suppose country A moves from L to N, then country A, instead of getting a welfare of 2, will get a welfare of 3. Once again, for the same reason, You will attract the more skilled people, you've lowered your tax, and the other country will do the same. If both of you charge a negligible tax, you will get a welfare of one each. So if you leave countries in today's globalized world to follow policies in terms of their complete individual welfare with no coordination of policy, you will end up at a negligible tax rate where individually you're doing as well as for yourself, but you're doing badly collectively. Now, you know, the tax example that I'm giving is not the ideal example. There are many other domains of life where today's globalization means there is need for globalized policy. Very good examples are also from monetary policy. A country has a central bank that injects liquidity or pulls out liquidity. In the olden days, when you go for quantitative easing and inject liquidity into your economy, your own prices tend to go up, your own growth tends to go up. Nowadays, that impact is much less because when you inject liquidity into your economy, large part of that liquidity will spill over your boundaries and go to other countries elsewhere. So we, in fact, have been seeing that during the QE phase of rich countries from 2008, the benefit that was being got from the quantitative easing in the United States, in Europe, in UK, was very limited. And a lot of the benefit and the disbenefits were being felt in faraway emerging economies, in China, in India, in the Philippines, even in Turkey, Vietnam, where what was happening is your growth rate is doing fine, but your inflationary pressure suddenly picks up. May have nothing to do with your country, but it's a globalized world. So we see these global connections in a variety of areas. In many areas, there is recognition. So we have global institutions for handling this. In the area of labor problems, you have ILO trying to coordinate on global labor. In the area of trade policy, you have WTO trying to coordinate on trade exercises. But when it comes to fiscal policy and taxation, there is very little effort. What I tried to argue is that we are reaching a world today, in our globalized world, where even policies which are directed at the poor, there is need for a certain amount of coordination across countries in order to get the maximum benefit, because if you leave it to individual countries to pursue their own selfish ends, it may appear good for that country, but collectively you will end up at the NN box where all of you are worse off. So there is need for a lot of global coordination of policy, even when it comes to anti-poverty policies. With that, let me stop. Thank you very much.